it's a real pleasure for me to moderate this session between three extremely talented writers, three very different writers, but three writers who nonetheless have shared a commitment to retelling stories. And it's also worth noting that despite their differences in background, experience, interest, that their retellings are equally fascinating experiments in style, which is something that I hope we'll speak about. So let me start off by asking all of you. This panel is called Retold. And to a certain extent, what is compelling for me is about the compulsion to retell. One of the dominant narratives about creativity is, and it's perhaps a narrative that could only take root in a capitalist age, is that a story is worthwhile only if it's absolutely original, if it has come fully formed out of your genius, without any influence from elsewhere. But retellers have a very different relationship to creativity and other texts. So what was the compulsion that led you to retell, and retell the telling or the tellings plural? And actually in all your cases, it's multiple original stories that you have retold. What led you to retell it in the way that you did? Maybe we'll start with you, Karthika.
Other retellings, or other tellings, as A.K. Ramanujan would have it, because he said there was never an text. And you know, the word retelling implied there is an original sacrosanct text. One very bad, well, it was, you know, very successful, etc., but it was fairly Manichaean, and it annoyed me intensely, though I wasn't sure quite why until I read its obverse, in a sense. The incredible and unforgettable Sarpasatra by Arun Kolatkar. That was the direct trigger. I read it, and so it's a retelling of the Mahabharata, which is probably the most slender of books. Within maybe 100 pages in verse, Arun Kolatkar told you the gist of the Mahabharata through the snake sacrifice that bookends the epic. Again, in several voices, but the most striking of which was that of Jaratkuru, the snake woman, so to say, whose son Astitwa ends up saving the snake race. And a lot of it is her exhortation to him as to why he needs to do that. And as I say, boringly often, it rewired my synapses.
And so what about you, Samhita?
So I think retelling has so much, because so many of these epics and these stories also define our identities and our culture and our feeling of belonging to a particular culture. I started writing my Mahabharata when I was, a lot of people know this, when I was 8 years old. But 3 years prior to that, my father, who's sitting here in this audience, was posted by the Indian government to the Indian consulate in Karachi. And we lived there for 3 years. And when we came back, I went to a school in India, in Delhi. And it was in 1992, which is obviously a significant year, given also the ruling yesterday. And it was the year of Babri Masjid, and I came as a child to a school in Delhi, and I happened to tell everyone that I'd come from Karachi, Pakistan. The wrong thing to say in 1992 when you are the new kid in a school. I was promptly, kind of bullied, ostracized. I was called Pagal Pakistani. And my refuge was to turn to the Mahabharata. Because in many ways, I think the Mahabharata is a story of war within a family, between the Pandavas and the Kauravas. They're fighting for inheritance. And I felt very much like the story of my life between India and Pakistan, and being somewhere caught in the middle. I felt a great deal of resonance with a Karna, because he too was caught in that middle. And for me, retelling has also a way of working through these moments that defy explanation, that defy boundaries, definitions. And I think that is the true power of these stories. And we're losing that sometimes when we try to put them in one narrow box and use them to define our identities. I think similarly, the Ramayana has been something that I've really had to push against, because it's helped define so much of our gender roles. So Sita's Ramayana is an attempt also to expand using other traditions, other oral traditions that we are losing in this age, to expand that sense, to question it, to provoke it. Because I think also in that way, we're losing that kind of ground and that kind of space today. So for me, retelling is always also an act to transform the stories to accommodate who we are in the present. Retelling, if you retell a story, in some ways you reorder your own internal reality, and that can very powerfully affect the circumstances around you.
Gayathri.
Yes, thank you. So I retold the Vikram Vetal stories. And this is a cycle of stories. So it's the Vetala Panchavimshati in Sanskrit, 11th century Somadeva's text, Katha Sarit Sagar in Sanskrit. This cycle of stories is in that. So here's where I had an advantage, is that pretty much everybody, and there are many, many storytellers of the Vikram Vetal stories, and in fact within the Katha Sarit Sagar. So the Katha Sarit Sagar is a frame narrative, like those Russian dolls, like dolls within dolls within dolls. So everybody in there, so when I first started to read, it was quite stunning. So I start telling a story about Gil, and Gil suddenly starts telling a story about, Samhita. Samhita starts telling a story about Karthika. So it goes on and on and on, like many storytellers. So I had the advantage of working with a text where everybody is a reteller. So I was one more reteller. And it really makes you think, because this is the beauty of stories. Every time we tell it, we make it our own. And according to the Katha Sarit Sagar, so is there an original text, like you said? So for the Katha Sarit Sagar, the original text is Shiva is telling the story to Parvati. And the story is overheard by a Gana, who is then cursed. And the curse is, you have to retell. So retelling is the curse. And how do you release yourself from the curse? You retell, right? So both listening and storytelling is part of retelling. And I think sometimes as authors, we think so much about that sense of authorship or what authorship means, but the fact that stories are also a shared, which is, I think, the insight of the Katha Sarit Sagar for me, that there is something called a shared storytelling that we all participate in. The listener participates in as much as the teller, and that was the lesson for me, and which is why I enjoyed trying a retelling.
Gayatri, your remarks underline how some of the received understandings of texts from antiquity, in particular epic texts, Puranas, etc., that received understanding is a little bit at odds with how these stories actually work. I mean, it was, for instance, driven home to me when I was an undergraduate that epic is something monologic, that it is the story of a community. And to that extent, it is a story that is sacred, that is reiterated, but reiterated in deference to some kind of original understanding of who we are and who we should be. And what you're saying reminds us that stories are, by definition, polyvocal, that stories are promiscuous, that stories keep moving across boundaries. And something that strikes me about all your retellings is how multi-voiced they are. Just to give you a sense, Gayatri's Vital and Vikram begins with an extraordinary genealogy of the various reiterations of the story, which culminates in the reader herself. And Until the Lions is multi-voiced. If you heard Karthika's extraordinary reading earlier today, Karthika with Rahul, you would have heard that her echoes of the Mahabharata are multiple echoes. There are many voices at play. Could I get you to talk a little bit about the way in which each of your retellings, and I think it applies as much to you, Samhita, and the graphic novel form, and the various other forms you've chosen in your retellings. The multi-voicedness of your retellings seems to be a crucial part of retelling. So let's mix things up this time. Why don't we start with you, Gayathri, and then move this way?
Well, the question about voices, and for me, maybe I'll answer it very specifically, is that in my case, it was, of course, the fact that the stories were so delightfully worldly and everyday, and that they felt contemporary to me, and they are. And I was able to, I was thinking, I have to say this story in my voice, because you're right, there's a genealogy of, there are many, many texts. So Somadeva says, I'm not original. I also borrow from another text, and this is a text that we haven't found. So there are many texts we found, we haven't found. But what I realized then is that in all these tellers, none of the tellers were women, they're all men. And I was aware that I was stepping in my time, in my historical moment, my historical time, my consciousness, my awareness, and like Samhita said, my experiences. And so I knew that I would have to say this in my voice. So that is to say, how did I make these stories mine? But the other question also is that these stories are full of voices. Not just the stories themselves, but every reteller has added their voice. So just to make it very specific, one quick example is that the reason why I started on this project was because I walked into a bookstore some 10 years ago, and I saw a book. It said Vikram and the Vampire, and the subtitle was Tales of Hindu Devilry. And this is the only English translation that is right now actually available in the bookstore of the Vikram Vetal stories. And it was done in the 19th century by a British, an Englishman called Richard Francis Burton. And so when I realized that, of course, the initial starting point was annoyance with the title and this whole Victorian superimposition of vampires and devilry and all of that. But then I said, it's not, it can't just be a response. And so the way I did this was that I included Burton as a character. So Burton is very much in this. So the voices of the tellers and the voices, because Burton heard the story too, so the voices of the listeners, those voices are there too. And I do think that retelling is an awareness that many voices have said this story before us. And it is not to say that one is different or not different, but how does one participate in this collective telling, right? Many voices.
Karthika, the multi-voicedness is apparent in your choice in Until the Lions of writing in prose poetry that some of the lines are bolded, some are in normal typeface, and it creates this sort of wonderful sense of a conversation within the text. But also characters like Amba, Shikandi, and the fact that they become central characters, as they are in Mahabharata, but become even more important in your story, adds to the sense of this being a polyphony. So can you talk a little bit about your choice to multi-voice your Until the Lions?
Well, the premise with which I started was that the battle never looks the same to various actors, depending on whether you're on the periphery, whether you're in the thick of the battle, whether you're on a horse, a chariot, an elephant, or you're sitting on your throne, listening to an account of it by someone else. And it was that desire to bring out the variety of experiences and the fact that a king would never know what his foot soldier or the family of that foot soldier would have to undergo. And I think that is, it's something that was drilled into me by my father, who was in the army and fought in all three of the wars in the 60s and 70s. And it was a reminder that I think these experiences are timeless. Those of battle and the differences in perception between what is glory and what is reality. The voices themselves, and sometimes you're right, they're in conversation with themselves or each other or variants of themselves. So Amba and Shikandi, for instance, it's one poem and it's two bodies but inhabiting the same soul. And Amba speaks of the past. It's manual for revenge and remembrance. Amba embodies remembrance. Shikandi embodies revenge. And Amba's voice is given in grayscale, if you've noticed, though in that particular edition, the grayscaling isn't totally successful. And Shikandi's is in thick black. There's also a difference in form. Amba begins by speaking in sonnets. It's an ordered memory. Then when she speaks of the abduction, it's free verse. And at a point, there's no punctuation. It's run on lines because it is an ordeal that she's reliving. Whereas Shikhandi, who's become this instrument for vengeance, speaks in a variant of the Siharfi, which is originally a devotional form of poetry where it's like an abecedere, you run through the alphabet. But Shikhandi's only devotion is to her purpose. And so the onslaught of the alphabet is a command to war. It is a manual for war.
Samhita, is what Gayathri and Karthika are saying, does it ring true in terms of your sense of retelling, whether it's Silapadikaram or Sita's Ramayan or Mahabharat, the multi-voicedness of the act of retelling?
Well, I think this is something very interesting because Vikram and the Baital is a frame narrative. So is the Mahabharata, so is the Ramayana. And what I mean by a frame narrative is that it's, as she was saying, Russian dolls, a story within a story within a story. And there are always multiple voices and multiple twists. And the Arabian Nights has this, the Canterbury Tales has this. This is a sort of a fantastic literary invention that might have, I think, likely originated here and was exported out. If we can claim one thing that's Indian in origin, perhaps it is the frame story. But what the frame story does is always subvert, it always questions. And there's another interesting parallel process, I think, that happens when we look at oral narratives. Sometimes what is preserved in text, and this is a large generalization, but what text preserves is the dominant political narrative, right? And we see that reflected in a lot of the actual narrative texts that get preserved. The contesting narrative, the alternative side of the story, is what we sometimes find in visual traditions, and we also find in oral traditions, like in the Patua tradition, which is both a visual and an oral tradition. It's a very subversive kind of a Ramayana. It's a provocative kind of a Ramayana in many respects. And I think we must also remember that as much as literature is about text, these are also different kinds of literature. And text sometimes is a power, as its capital, and sometimes that preserves a politically powerful kind of an idea. So for us to go back and question this many-voicedness, sometimes we have to pull in all these kinds of different sources as well. And we will find always that there is another side to the story. Always there is a different retelling.
One question I'd want to ask is not just about your specific retellings, but there is a way in which the very word retelling seems to presume that there is an origin. A retelling is a retelling of something that came before, that is primary. To what extent, though, have your voyages in retelling these various narratives brought home for you that every story is always already a retelling? Is there any such thing as a completely original story?
So I find actually the Shilapatikaram quite interesting in this respect, because we think of it, when I sort of grew up as a child, I lived in Chennai, my mother is from Chennai, so we sort of grew up with that story and we thought of it as an original story. But then you go back into the history and you get exposed to Sangam poetry and you discover that the Kannagi of the Shilapatikaram, wait, no, there's another Kannagi in a lot of Sangam poetry, and she's actually unlike the Kannagi of a Shilapatikaram, who's an ordinary woman who goes on to sort of challenge the king of Madurai when her husband is unjustly executed and her wrath burns down Madurai. Well, there's another Kannagi, and this time she's kind of similar because her husband is also, having enough. There's a lot of similarities between the Kannagi of the Shilapatikaram and the other Kannagi, but the other Kannagi is an actual historical figure. She's not a common woman, though. She's a queen. And she's written about in the poems of Kapilar and Pananar, who are other Sangam era poets. But Ilango Adigal has borrowed the story and turned it into an epic and changed a lot of the other parts of it around. So I think there's always been a kind of a borrowing between this idea of authenticity or of originality. I think always they're borrowing from each other. The Mani Mekalai, which is in some way seen as the sequel to the Shilapatikaram, has many of the same characters, including Madhavi the courtesan. And it's written by Ilango Adigal's best friend. So clearly this is also a definition of friendship. If you're best buds, you can take each other's characters and use them in different ways. But so I think there's that as well.
No, I think every story was told and retold and told differently since forever, because as human beings, this is perhaps the one great gift we have. It is a power to imagine, it is a power to empathize and to transmit what we have imagined or heard. And we were talking about dominant narratives and the fact that, they are maybe the ones that are enshrined in a written form or a permanent form or in a stele, but the variants or the originally dominant, because dominance changes. It's a good thing to remember that, what is dominant today is not what's dominant tomorrow.
Inshallah.
Touche. and I think performative art is a great reminder of that. So you have, also to add, the great freedom, which is what we're always in danger of losing, is the ability to do this, is the ability to imagine, is the ability to tell with impunity, with criticism certainly, but with the freedom to tell and to imagine. Take away the imagination, and you have nothing else left. What distinguishes us from creatures we deem, inferior and discardable? Again, I think the performative tradition is our great savior, because that's where there are vestiges from various centuries of narratives, and it's a great tradition which is true to all of the world, but is extant still in various parts of Asia and South Asia more than they are perhaps in Greece. Greek theater is not necessarily performed today the way it was 2,000 years ago, whereas you do have performative forms in various parts of Asia.
And this, of course, was to a certain extent the burden of the argument in Ramanujan's famous, infamous essay about the 300 Ramayans that was banned 8 years ago in the DU curriculum as a result of political pressure. The thought that certain texts might not be originary, might take multiple forms, might be open to critical retelling, was too much for certain political factions, which leads me to my next question. Have any of you faced pushback as a result of the text that you have chosen to retell? Have any of you been asked, how dare you retell the story in the way you have in particular? Or no comment?
Okay, no. Well, my book is a week old, so I don't think enough people have, I don't know. So I haven't heard from anyone yet. But what I do want to add, perhaps, is that one of the things I loved about Vikram and Vetal's stories and why I picked it up is because I realized every story ends with, of course, Vetal asking a question that Vikram has to then answer. So it's not just, of course, there's a trick there, but it's the idea that there is that listening, that story listening is also part of storytelling, and that you have to listen and then you have to participate. Also, all the versions of Vikram and Vetal are talk about 25 stories. So it's Vetala Panchavimshati or it is Vetal Pachisi. But of course, in all the languages, Tamil, Nepali, they've only found 24 stories, not 25, 24. And it says something about, and I've thought about this, and several scholars have, and I think it has something to do with the fact that Vikram and Vetal are themselves the 25th story. Like they are part of the story. Like even as we write it, we write ourselves into the story. So I feel like what is lovely about perhaps some of the texts that draw us to it is because the pushback is already in the text. Like we are engaging with the resistances, the undercurrents in the text. Therein lies the challenge of the retelling, and therein lies the satisfaction of the perspective that I bring into it today as I write the story. I'm listening too, but I can't be a passive listener. I have to push back, and it's a happy pushback. You know, at least for me, it's been deeply pleasurable pushback. And the stories are, right?
As a coda to that, and for people who talk about retellings, the Mahabharata contains the Sri Parva in itself. So, assumedly, written by Vyasa, where the women, the widows, the mothers, the grieving survivors, rail against what has happened, rail against the divinity, against Krishna, and it finishes with Gandhari cursing him and questioning this moral supremacy that actually allows something like the war to happen. And he himself is self-aware of the choices he has made. So if Vyasa himself provided space for criticism, if we are to consider, shall we call it the ur text, our source, it provides that space, like you said, for questioning. It begins with space for reproach.
At risk of bringing my own specialization into the conversation, people often reverentially regard Shakespeare as a devta and as the exemplum, the perfect example of an original writer, which of course mystifies the fact that every one of Shakespeare's 37 plays is a rewriting of a story that comes earlier. Shakespeare was a kabadiwala, and it's arguable that the act of storytelling is to be a kabadiwala. You're taking materials from elsewhere, stitching them up in new ways, and recycling them. It's your turn now, as listeners, as active listeners who get to retell the story, to ask a question or two. So, do we have any questions? Clearly, we haven't done our work. No? No?
If not, can we ask
It's
each
very
other
hard to
questions?
see. Yes.
Can we ask each other questions?
Yes, go ahead.
If you had to work on another text, which one would it be?
Oh, that's interesting. I'm actually working right now on one of the Chinese foundational legends. So yes, it's quite a distance to travel,
Wow.
but yeah.
But there is a connection between the Ramayana and Chinese foundational texts.
No, there was on the one that I worked on before. So this is the second one. Yes, it worked on a stage production of Nuba. So that's actually one of the Chinese foundational myths as opposed to the legends. Now I'm working on one of the legends. But yes, and it was interesting because it went back to the creation of the universe. So yeah, there's always a connection.
Can I just put in a plug? Please buy these books. They are superb reads. I normally fall asleep on planes quite happily with the book that I'm reading. It's a way to sort of encourage sleep, but I couldn't put these books down. So Until the Lions by Karthika, The Prince by Samhita, and Retell and Vikram by Gayathri. These are extraordinary original retellings of old stories that you think you know.